Next, science writers John Brockman, Daniel Dennett, and Marvin Minsky discuss current theories on the origin of the universe, evolution, and the work of their late colleague Stephen Jay Gould. This, from a Barnes & Noble in New York City, lasts an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Kahn, president of Barnes & Noble Publishing. We at Barnes & Noble are thrilled to be publishing the new Humanists, Science at the Edge, a book filled with cutting-edge ideas. We have dead mics up here. This little one working now? I'm Alan Kahn from Barnes & Noble. We at Barnes & Noble are thrilled to be publishing the new Humanists, Science at the Edge, a book filled with cutting-edge ideas from many brilliant scientists and empirical thinkers. Two of them are here tonight, Daniel C. Dennett and Marvin Minsky. They will discuss how the universe designs itself. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce John Brockman, the editor of the New Humanists. As well as being a well-known author and editor, Mr. Brockman is president of the EDGE Foundation and the founder, president, and editor of EDGE, a website that serves as an intellectual forum for science and other thinkers. EDGE, which has more than 100,000 visitors and participants, features some of the best minds of today, including such well-known intellectuals as Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker, Jared Lanier, Ray Kurzweil, and our two speakers tonight. EDGE captures online the continuing conversations of these prominent members of the EDGE community. The New Humanists was derived from this preeminent group of intellectuals and scientists. They illustrate Brockman's theory that we are entering a third culture, one defined by the coming together of the humanities and science. Brockman calls for a new energy between these two areas, which are often viewed as separate or incompatible. Tonight's discussion will illustrate Brockman's theory and the lively spirit of EDGE. Barnes & Noble is proud to be associated with EDGE and a book that highlights some of the best scientific thinkers of the 21st century. Here to introduce our panelists is John Brockman.
A key to this book is the idea that the central metaphor of our time, the central metaphor of our time is computation. It's about the computer, the models we create by using computers, and the act of computing or computation. It's running across all the disciplines, and I realized having seminars of groups that included Marvin and Dan that will have biologists, artificial intelligence experts, physicists, and what connects them all is the notion of computation. In terms of that field, about 10 years ago when I put together the book, The Third Culture, I introduced Marvin as the leading light of AI, that is, artificial intelligence. He sees the brain as a myriad of structures. Scientists who, like Minsky, take a strong AI view, believe that a computer model of the brain will be able to explain what we know of the brain's cognitive abilities. Minsky identifies consciousness with high-level abstract thought and believes in principle that machines can do everything that a conscious human being could do. For Dan Dennett, I said that Dan is interested in consciousness. His view, similar to Minsky's, is as a high-level abstract thinking. He's known as the leading proponent of the computational model of mind, and in that regard, people like Pinker have followed on and developed this along with Dan. He has clashed with philosophers such as John Searle, who maintain that the most important aspects of consciousness, intentionality and subjective quality, can never be computed. He's the philosopher of choice of the AI community. In this most recent work, he has turned to what he calls Darwin's dangerous idea. He's squarely in the Darwinian camp of George C. Williams or Richard Dawkins, and he has mustered with great energy a serious critique of the scientific ideas of Stephen Jay Gould. It was the critique of Gould, all 100 pages, that ended a lot of people's relationships with Gould. When someone like Dennett writes 100 pages about you, you have to stop what you're doing and spend 3 years to respond. Now that that is over, it's been about 10 years, and Gould, unfortunately, is no longer with us. Dennett is writing a new book called Breaking the Spell, in which he's going to relax a bit after Gould and take on God. Marvin, when I was doing this Third Culture book, we had asked everybody in the book to comment on the other people, and Marvin's comment about Dan was, well, he's our greatest philosopher since Russell. 6 months later, I sent the galleys, and he said, I wrote that? What I meant is the greatest philosopher that understands what we're doing. So I will turn it over to address the topic of how the universe designs itself. I've asked each of these gentlemen to speak for 15 minutes, uninterrupted, ask each other some questions, and then we'll open it to the floor. Do you want to start? Marvin is just back from Japan and probably jet lagged.
Probably asleep, but I usually wait for someone to ask a question and then talk longer than they expected.
Do you want to go second?
Sure. I just want to know if John made up that title.
Yeah.
How the universe.
What would you like to talk about, Marvin?
I'd just like, in passing, to say that I don't think the universe exists. I'll just say a few bits, and then I want to see how Dennett reacts. A lot of people feel that there are some important questions that science can't answer, and that's why they resort to religion. And one of the questions, well, there are various questions that are very hard to answer, like where did the world come from? And, or in a more naive way, who made the world? Because everything you see in civilization was made by somebody. Nobody made rocks, and so what do you do about those exceptions? And you imagine some super being from the X-Files or X-Men or something who can make whole worlds, and that gives people a warm, fuzzy feeling. Which, and of course, the idea of God is wonderful because it's the answer to all questions you can't understand. And in this book that I'm finishing, but you can read chapter 4 on my webpage, it's a discussion of consciousness, and it's quite harmonious with what Dennett has said, because I use the same idea that there isn't any one thing that's consciousness. There's a lot of stuff, and in particular, different parts of your mind are making different stories and weaving them together, and there's all sorts of negotiations. But on a larger scale, I think the word consciousness is a very convenient word to have because it's the name for all of the things your mind does that you don't have any idea about. And it's useful to have such words. And God is the name of the answer to all the questions about the world that you don't have a good answer to. So let me just say what you can do about that. And the first thing is to notice that there's something wrong with who made the world. Religious people have trained themselves not to worry about that, because you say, who made the world? And they say God, and you say, who made God? And they say, that's rude. Or God made itself, or it was always there, or whatever. Isn't it stunning that that's not considered an objection to the God theory? That it's, whereas in science it would be regarded as, well, there's something wrong with your theory. But let's be a little more serious. If you look at the question, who made everything, or why does the universe exist, there's something wrong with the word exist. Because what does it mean to say this alleged spring water exists? Do you see these big trucks driving by every day full of Evian or whatever it is, spring water, and you count the number of trucks and guess how many people drink it and figure out what size pipe is coming out of some poor little hill somewhere. Anyway, to say something exists says that it's in the universe. To say the universe exists is a little bothersome. It's a sort of problem that Bertrand Russell, Dan's predecessor, worried about and decided that you had to be very careful about statements where a thing is part of itself or a subset of itself or something. So it doesn't mean anything to say the universe exists, because that would be to say the universe is inside itself. It's all right to say the universe is itself, but it doesn't seem right to say that it's part of itself. So how do you get out of that? And it seems to me you shouldn't be asking what made everything. You should be saying, what could this word exist mean that we're so quickly extending from very little things like the water is in the bottle to the bottle is in the universe. What's the universe in? And I think the best answer is that that's probably meaningless. There are probably a lot of possible universes, and there's nothing special about any of them. This is just what would happen if you had a big computer and dropped a program into it, and it simulates all this. But suppose somebody wrote that program, then that world would exist in the sense that this program says what it would do. Suppose they didn't write the program. Suppose you never loaded it into a computer. It would still be the same possible world. Suppose you didn't even write the program. Well, somebody else might have written it. What difference does it make if somebody's written it or even thought of it? Well, I'm not joking. It seems to me that this is a possible logical system or unlogical system or whatever. And then what you have to do is ask, is there anything special about it? And obviously there is. This is one that could have people in it. And what's more, since Darwin, you can't just drop people into a world. You have to evolve them. They have to come somewhere. The universe has to make them, as John hints. And what does that mean? Well, that universe had better have some conservation laws, like energy. Suppose you didn't have, in other words, why is the world the way it is? Physicists are nervous about this kind of argument, called the anthropic argument, and I'm not sure why they're so nervous. It's a great argument. If the world didn't have conservation laws like the ones Newton discovered, energy is conserved, momentum and angular momentum are conserved as long as they don't bump into anything. What would happen if you didn't have that law, or if the universe didn't have that constraint? Well, every now and then something would start generating energy and maybe make little parts that do the same thing, and in 5 minutes the entire galaxy would blow up. Some physicists say, how come the universe is such that the Einstein coefficient is very close to 1? And the answer is, if the universe were expanding much faster or contracting much faster, of course, we might have been in it once, but we wouldn't be now. And so lots of things about the universe have to be that way, or else things wouldn't be stable for long enough to evolve, which, as far as we know, usually takes half a billion years. We only have one example of it, and that's about how long it took. Then it took, it's only 500 million years since we were fish. So there was about 3 billion years of nothing much happening. There was a moment, when was the Cambrian explosion?
530 million years.
Yeah, that's right. And in that, there was a book by Stephen Gould that I hated because it was so romantic. It was called Wonderful Life. He made little references to Jimmy Stewart and things in it. Steve had a wonderfully homey way of combining the familiar with the ridiculous. And the big mystery to him was, how come just at this moment in evolution did suddenly animals develop literally millions of kinds of forms? You take this bunch of shale, which is only 10 million or so years wide, it's not much, and there's hardly any kind of animal at first, and then there are all these forms and snails and little things, practically insect-like stuff. And Gould makes up some theory that Darwinism isn't really a very good theory because it would suggest that things happen slowly and steadily, whereas things happen very suddenly. But what happened? That's when animals got little nervous systems. And what happens when an animal gets a nervous system? Well, it can crawl around and you can evolve mechanisms. But what happens when that little brain has any kind of learning at all? Something very dramatic happens, which was understood by, what was Baldwin's name, the great evolutionist?
Somebody marked Baldwin.
Around 1900.
Yeah, I can't think of what his first name was, but...
But this is the Baldwin effect, and
Yep.
Steve Gould didn't seem to know about it. Here's what happens. Suppose you have something like a crab, and this crab has evolved exactly to eat a certain kind of seaweed by detecting it and going like that. What would happen if there was a mutation and the poor crab's arms went like that? Would starve to death. And so animals had to be very rigid before they could learn. But if an animal was like this and by accident it happened to do this, it could remember it. And so the point is that once you got a nervous system that could learn, a deformity was not fatal. And that's exactly the time of the Cambrian explosion. So the creatures could mutate but still survive. And there was something that looks like an explosion, and that Darwin has not explained this, and of course he has. So I'll stop and see if we can get into an argument.
Okay, well, Marvin lives for arguments, and I've known him for, 30 years, and he'll, if you don't start arguing with him right away, he'll say things more and more outrageous until finally you realize that you're supposed to resist. But today, he started right off by saying the universe doesn't exist. Now, he's already played his trump card. I don't know how if you're not going to balk at that, how are you going to balk? But I'm going to resist the temptation for the moment, because I want to, first of all, I want to follow up on a point he just made about the Cambrian explosion. Yes, Steve Gould said it was a sort of an embarrassment to classical Darwinism, because it was this embarrassment of riches, this fabulous time of creativity when all these new life forms came into existence very fast, and then most of them disappeared very fast. Strange architectures, body plans that didn't survive at all. Well, he wasn't very imaginative about what might explain it, and I think Marvin has put his finger on it, but there's a book that came out just this last year by the Oxford zoologist Andrew Parker, which really I highly recommend if you want a very good read on this topic. It's called In the Blink of an Eye. And Parker's thesis is that 530, 540 million years ago, that's when, for reasons he's not very clear about, the oceans became transparent. And light, for some chemical reason, now you had a medium in which you could see, if only you had eyes. And this is when eyes evolved. They evolved as soon as a medium of transparency evolved. All life was in the water at that point. And there was locomotion, but it was sort of blind, groping locomotion. There were worms and things like that, but they couldn't see where they were going. They were just sort of bumping around. And as soon as the water became transparent, vision evolved. And once vision evolves, the great game of hide and seek begins. Now you can see at a distance. Now you have an epistemic horizon, which is getting farther away. You don't have to wait till you bump into something. Once you don't have to bump into something, once you have radar, in effect, once you have distal perception, it's a whole new ballgame. Suddenly, the predators can see the prey, and the prey can see the predators. And the tremendous, the prodigious creative energy of evolution was unleashed by all you have to do is render the ocean more transparent, and we're off to the races. It's an arms race. Now, what's nice about Andrew Parker's theory is that it's testable, and there's many predictions that it makes, and it may not in the end be quite right, but it completely gives the lie to the idea that this sudden explosion of creativity by evolution is any sort of an anomaly or any sort of an embarrassment to evolution. If it's an embarrassment at all, it's an embarrassment of riches. There are many, many possibilities to explain why the Cambrian explosion happened, and as I like to say in the consciousness wars, of which I am a part, I am very tolerant of all sorts of craziness that goes on in the world of consciousness research. And my sort of Maoist motto is, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but then remember that 999 of them are going to wilt. There's an awful lot of junk out there, and let's get it behind us as soon as we can, and then we'll get to the good theories. And I think that's what happened in the Cambrian explosion for itself. Now, I'm really sorry that Lee Smolin isn't here, because actually John invited us all to submit a title for this, and I was the one that came up with How the Universe Designs Itself, and I really thought of this as an occasion when Marvin and I were going to provoke Lee, because that's in a way more his idea than ours, but it's a very interesting idea. And let me just explain to you how I conceived of this topic, and I will do my best to do some rough justice to some of Lee's ideas. As some of you know, one of my big things for, oh my gosh, 30 years and more, has been what I call the three stances: the intentional stance, the design stance, and the physical stance. But I want to talk about the design stance. If you look around the world, you see a lot of things that seem to be designed. Obviously, the artifacts in front of us, the watch, the microphone, even this plastic glass, these have all been designed by intelligent designers to serve various purposes. But so does everything in the living world seem to be designed, and exquisitely designed. That's the famous argument from design. And until Darwin came along, it was a magnificent argument. It really was impressive. These things can't be accidents, as Paley had said. And in fact, I have hypothesized that this idea that there's no design without a designer is perhaps older than our species. How could that be? Well, before there was Homo sapiens sapiens, that's us, there was Homo habilis, you know, the handyman that made tools. We've been making tools since before there was Homo sapiens. We've been making stone axes and things like that. And I think perhaps as long as hominids have been making tools, it has seemed just crashingly obvious that it takes a big fancy thing to design and make a simpler thing. You never see a pot making a potter. You never see a horseshoe making a blacksmith. It's always wonderful, big, fancy things making things which are considerably less wonderful. It's sort of the trickle-down theory of design. And I think that was just obvious to the world until Darwin. And when Darwin put forward the theory of natural selection, all of a sudden, an alternative became available. And in fact, one of his earliest critics, thank goodness for this man, an otherwise anonymous man named Robert Beverly Mackenzie, wrote a very heated and outraged negative review of The Origin of Species. And there's a passage in it which I just love to quote, and I actually wrote it out, I printed it out so that I could get it right. I love this, partly for the outrage. Let me just read what Robert Beverly Mackenzie had to say about Darwin's dangerous idea. He said, "In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance," and he capitalizes that, A-I, absolute ignorance is the artificer, so that we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. This proposition will be found, on careful examination, to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who, by a strange inversion of reasoning, seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. Bingo. Yes, that is exactly what Darwin is saying. Absolute ignorance can take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. That's the strange inversion of reasoning that Darwin introduces to us, and it goes down hard. This is really a revolutionary turning upside down of the way we've thought about creation and design since before we were even Homo sapiens. And what we've seen in the time just since Darwin is a series of sort of retreats on the part of thoughtful people trying to deal with this strange idea that you can have design, manifest design in the biosphere without an intelligent designer. Asa Gray, who was a contemporary of Darwin's, a professor at Harvard, famously said, well, you see, God isn't the designer of each and every critter, all creatures great and small. God designs the system that then churns out the bunch of them. He chooses the physics, if you like, and the fundamental biological principles, and then just turns the crank and lets all the rest of the design happen. And he had a lovely phrase for it. He said, design by wholesale is even better than design by retail. So God, the wholesale designer, is the successor to God, the individual handicrafter. But then people began to think, well, what about these laws of nature that God so cleverly devised so that evolution could happen? Here's where Lee Smolin really comes in, because Lee and other cosmologists and physicists have suggested that these exquisitely tuned constants of physics, Marvin was talking about this, these uncannily precisely chosen values of the variables that permit our universe to be one in which life can evolve, because carbon atoms are sticky enough to be a sort of great glue, the fundamental glue that holds things together in fancy mechanisms. Maybe those aren't so much constant as just locally constant. Maybe there's a whole lot of universes out there, and we just happen to be in one, of course. We couldn't be in any other, where all the laws are just right. If you're in a universe that has life, it's going to have laws that are life-friendly, that make it possible. This is the anthropic principle. Now, so then God gets demoted from lawgiver to not even to law chooser, because now we suppose, well, the part of the universe that we're in has these laws, but it's no accident that should be so. We don't need God to choose the laws, because the other parts of the universe where there are other laws, they also exist or may exist for all we know. So God is demoted again. So what's God now? Well, he's sort of a master of ceremonies, I guess. Or maybe, our Father who playest air guitar, or something like that. So we've watched this somewhat graceful and somewhat graceless retreat where God is given less and less to do, to the point where it's no longer such a mystery that he should be omnipotent. If you don't have any job, then it's not so hard to be omnipotent. Now, these ideas may amuse some of us, but they strike terror and repugnance in the minds of many people who want the traditional top-down view of an intelligent designer to prevail. And it's fascinating to see how even the most resourceful and wily scientific speculators can be drawn back again and again to the idea that maybe there's some way where we can save the idea of an intelligent designer after all. Well, in a way, I think we should all be agnostic about that. Maybe there is, but by the time we've established that, it is going to be so different from the original imagined creator that if those who are religious want to say something like, well, we told you so, we'll say, well, if you have to say that, go ahead. But of course it isn't. It's so remote from anything you ever imagined or could have imagined using your traditional point of view that it doesn't really count. Now, if Lee were here, if I may go on for just another minute or so, playing the Lee role, what's fascinating about Lee's work is that he's found some ways to take seriously, I mean very seriously as a physicist, the idea that evolution can actually apply below the biological level to the level of, in effect, universes or sub-universes themselves. That you can have an evolution of universes so that the universe can indeed design itself. If he was here, he would give you a version of that. I'm going to give you the joke version of it. There's a story I like about the young aspiring tenor, the operatic tenor, who finally gets his debut opera. Let's say it's at La Scala, where they take their opera very seriously. And at the end of the first act, he does his aria, and this roaring applause, standing applause, it goes on and on and on. He bows and bows and bows, and they keep yelling encore, so he does it again. And at the end of it the second time, they applaud again. And he goes off, and he comes out and takes a bow, and he goes off and comes out and takes a bow. They're still applauding. So he sings it a third time. And he goes off, and they're still clapping. And he's, of course, delirious with joy, but he's getting worn out at this point. And he comes back and says, no, thank you, no more. And somebody jumps up and says, no, we're going to make you do it again until you get it right. And that, in effect, is the Lee Smolin theory about universes, too. We're going to do it again until we get it right. That whole universes can, in effect, be rough drafts, semi-rough drafts, penultimate drafts, and so forth, that there can be a process of evolution of universes. And at first, when you encounter this idea, if you're like me, you're sort of cross-eyed and you think this is just too extravagant. There can't be any way of taking this seriously from the point of view of science. And that's an important point. I'm a philosopher, I'm not a scientist. And one thing I know is that imagination is cheap. We philosophers love to invent imaginary universes, possible worlds, and think about what's possible and what's not possible. But we're stuck with rather crude tools in a certain way, and that beyond brute logical possibility, which is a very weak notion, we're not very good, and we don't have any way of keeping ourselves honest. Many people thought of evolution before Darwin. He was not the first person to think of evolution by natural selection, but he was the one who figured out how to bring the empirical demands into the picture in such a way that you had to take the idea seriously. Now, Lee Smolin has done something which I would not, before he wrote, thought possible, and that is come up with the physics that at least requires you to take seriously the idea, which is not that hard to imagine, that there could be an evolution of universes themselves, that there could be an evolution of the very laws of physics that makes biological evolution possible. That doesn't mean that he's shown it's possible, but he has shown that we have to take it seriously. And that's where You can't do that if you're just a philosopher. That's one of the limitations of our trade, is that we don't have the leverage to sort out the imaginable into those things that are imaginable and also that should be taken seriously. For that, you need to make the game harder. You need to do some serious work so that people have to say, yeah, okay, that's a possibility we have to take seriously. I probably said enough now for Marvin to come in and contradict something I've said.
Maybe we should. I can't think of anything. I don't know Lee's theory. I know who's the guy who makes the Gaia theory?
Lovelock.
In which the Earth evolves some.
You have to move up to the mic.
Lovelock's theory is quite popular, but it doesn't. It's hard to make it work because if there's only one planet, he argues that as the history of the planet proceeds, the Earth learns to stabilize its temperature, and that there are various mechanisms that get selected so that finally we get a really stable planet. Of course, all of us are interested to know if we're alone in the universe, and if not, why aren't we getting email from the rest of it? And one possibility is that this delicate collection of parameters, like the temperature has to be between water freezing and boiling, stuff like that, has to remain, those constants have to remain, or non-constants have to remain bound for billions of years, because it took it's about 600 million years since the first multicellular creatures arrived, plants and animals both. But if the Earth made a mistake, there's no way it could learn from that mistake because there's only one of it. So I'm not sure what Lee's idea is. A single universe can't have selection, and it's hard to have evolution unless there's some selection. On the other hand,
no, he does have selection in his theory, and that's
okay.
What's interesting is that his theory proposes that, again, to be crude about it, that black holes are in effect birth options.
But do they make copies of things? That
they make copies with variation. That's the whole. That's the whole point.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm sorry Lee isn't here. I guess we should just maybe drop that topic because I don't want to do injustice to Lee's ideas there. But I want to suggest something about Lee's perspective and what Marvin was just saying about the need for a long period of constancy for evolution to take place. Well, even a billion years is just a fraction of, it's not even it's an infinitesimal fraction of infinity. So that you could have a stretch of a billion years of pattern is not in itself improbable.
But it's important for people to realize, since you can take it personally, that this particular situation we have here is only good for another 3 or 4 billion years, because that's when the sun becomes a red giant. So we've really got to get out of here pretty soon. And what's interesting is that people laugh when you say that, because it's ridiculous to try to survive, isn't it? And I think there is something wrong with people, that they're not very much concerned with the future. They want to live a normal life, and I've interviewed a lot of people as a result of writing an article on longevity in the Scientific American. And in a typical audience, if you ask people would they like to live 500 years, they all say no, almost all. And you say, why? And they say, well, because you'd be very creaky and you'd have arthritis. And I say, well, but suppose you could stay at your own age or half your present age. And they still don't want to, and now you ask why, and they say it's boring. However, if you talk to an audience of scientists, which is what I mostly do, it's completely different. They all have problems that they can't solve now, and they could use a couple of 100 years. And so it's interesting that that culture, the second culture, is wild about the idea of immortality, whereas the first culture really doesn't have any goals. It's trying to live a comfortable life. It goes to football games and wastes its synapses on stuff like that, and generally things are pretty boring. So that's a problem about the two cultures, and we should be doing something.
Open it up before Marvin empties the hall. There is a microphone right in the center aisle.
If I could prevail upon our audience members to come to the microphone here. If you'd like to ask a question, we do have time for a few questions. If you'd like to come up and ask your question from the microphone so that both our panel members and everybody can hear. Thank you.
The CIA has these great microphones. So
we have one brave questioner coming to the microphone.
But we can't afford one, I guess.
I got up quickly anticipating a rush and discovered I was the only one coming up.
You're representing everybody, so...
So just relax.
Yeah. The idea that we're part of a large ensemble of universes has been getting a lot of currency lately. I've read a couple of interesting papers by Max Tegmark that have some very interesting implications. One of the things that he notes is actually that the idea that there's an ensemble of universes is simpler than the idea that there's one, because there's less there's less algorithmic information density in an ensemble, in fact close to none, whereas a single one ironically has far more complexity to it. I was wondering, if any of you, well, Dr. Minsky was mentioning the idea that, that perhaps that the question of whether or not the universe exists is not an interesting one, perhaps, as Tegmark actually has suggested elsewhere, that, that any mathematically consistent set of rules that could give rise to life is going to be internally experienced. Yeah. I was wondering if you might want to expand upon that more.
No, I think there's no way you could tell whether you're in one that exists or not, and so it seems like you shouldn't spend any of your 30,000 days worrying about that. There must be 30,000 questions that are...
Let me make one little comment on that. I don't yet know how to assess Max Tegmark's ideas or David Deutsch's ideas or Lee Smolin's ideas, to name three, and Seth Lloyd and others. There's many, but I know this much. They're really interesting ideas that have more hooks on them than some of the old philosophical chestnuts. If you just ask yourself the question, why is there something rather than nothing? You're just sort of gobsmacked. There's nothing you can do with that question. You don't know what the background is. You don't know anything about what would count as an answer. Now, in one sense, that's, by my lights, that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is what you're doing when you don't know what the right questions are, and you don't know what would count as a good answer. But one of the reasons that I, as a philosopher, am interested in these proposals by the physicists is that they have shape, they have structure, they have detail. There's something you can do with them. Maybe some of them are completely crazy in the end, but we're going to be able to figure that out. They're not just waffling ideas. They're ideas that have implications that can be very carefully and rigorously developed. And that's the reason that I'm interested in them.
I have a remark about that, because I didn't bring it with me. There's a nice quote by a philosopher named John Searle, who says that 150 years ago, the latest thing was the telegraph, and people said, oh, maybe that's how animals work. The nerves are like telegraph wires. And then there was the telephone and radio. And he says artificial intelligence, or the computational idea of psychology, is just the latest fad, and it will pass too, because non-philosophers always adopt the latest technological breakthrough as their worldview. I just wanted to say that, and it's related to what Dan said, that I can't, well, when the students come in September and they say, I say, what do you want to study? And they say, I want to study computer science. I usually say, well, that's just a fad, in the sense that if you study computer science rather than mathematics for 4 years, then by your senior year, you'll have to start all over, because computers science obeys Moore's law, and the amount of it doubles every 4 years. So there's just no point in trying to keep up with that. But seriously, I think computer science is a new thing. It has nothing to do with computers. Those are just things for computing. What computer science did, starting around 1950, was to take up where mathematics had run flat. How do you describe very complicated systems? Well, mathematics is great for describing a system that depends on a few axioms or laws. Geometry has about 10 axioms. There's a beautiful thing called group theory that has 4, or maybe it's 5, and you can explore them in great depth. But if there's 50 assumptions, mathematics is sort of helpless. And if one of the assumptions says there's a switch where it can either go this way or that way, things are pretty bad. So what happened starting around 1950 was the development of new ways of describing things in terms of procedures that people had barely imagined. And then you had the computers to see what the consequences of these assumptions would be, even if you couldn't figure them out. So I think that in some sense, this is the last fad, but it will change into unrecognizably more powerful forms. And the idea of psychology being a collection, what happens if you have a whole collection of highly evolved computers interacting in highly evolved ways, is probably the answer to a lot of questions that had no answers at all before.
This question is to start with Dan. This is in regard to your book, Freedom Evolves, which I read a couple months ago and I very much enjoyed and can recommend. Now you start off the book by positing, free will compared to determinism, and in a way it's a false opposition, because we can look at free will. Freedom is something that clearly evolves from rocks to simple organisms to birds to humans. Something has changed in that progression, and we have to honor it and consider it and think about the implications, legal, religious, etc. But somewhere near the end of the book, you make a statement, if I'm remembering correctly, where you say that still doesn't get us past the conundrum of determinism, because as you go from one step, let's say the mind as a whole, down to cognitive modules, down to neurons, down to molecules, down to atoms, determinism still holds, but there's so many levels of so much complexity that we will never be able to do the computation, let's say from the atom to the human mind, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. No.
I see that that's a reading that might be invited, but that's not what I meant.
Can you elaborate? Because I see I still got your point about freedom as something that evolves, and therefore we can't we have to just throw out the whole deterministic conundrum. No.
What I was trying to argue was that freedom and determinism are entirely compatible. Determinism doesn't go away. I mean, who cares whether determinism is true, actually, because we can Marvin says a switch. We can have a switch, turn determinism on, turn determinism off, make it indeterministic. Nothing changes at the levels that matter to us. You're not going to be better off if you're living in an indeterministic world than if you're living in a deterministic world. The whole determinism, indeterminism at the level of physics issue, I argue, is simply orthogonal, simply irrelevant to the issues that really matter about freedom. What we want is to have free will that's morally important. I can define varieties of free will which are of no moral significance whatever, and then I can show that we either have them or don't, but who cares? The kind of free will that we're interested in is the kind that I illustrate by thinking about cases where I invite you to think of the worst thing you ever did. And then you think, well, could I have done otherwise? And is my regret, is it rational? Or am I somehow just involved in some absurd game? And I try to show why it can be rational, why it is rational to conceive of your life in terms of free choices. And it's not an illusion. But you have to understand that what free choices means and ought to mean is not what the philosophical tradition says it is. Does that help?
Well, yeah, because I do recall you would say that we have free will, but it's not the free will that most of us thought we had.
That's right.
Next question, please.
Hello. I haven't read any of your books, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to take God's side for just a little bit.
Sure.
And by means of kind of E.O. Wilson's sociobiological interpretation of what religion's about, you guys both seem to suggest, at least, that religion is something that the species kind of adopted because we needed some quick answers, and we've been kind of hesitant to get rid of because it explains things. Of course, Wilson's point is that religion is actually a very successful adaptation that the species made, and it's been so successful because it reinforces things like altruism and the family and social cohesion, and so it actually is no big problem.
Did he say things like that, or are you saying them?
Well, I'm saying the words I'm saying, but he wrote them on Human Nature years ago.
Yeah.
These were the freshman notes, yeah. And that it's, been a very successful idea.
Well, here's another really successful idea on the evolutionary time scale. If it's sweet, eat it. The sweet tooth is a fine adaptation, or was. We've outgrown that adaptation. It is now not fitness enhancing at all. In our hunter-gatherer days, the sweet tooth was a great adaptation to have. It really helped us. But now it's the bane of our existence, and we're working very hard to figure out how to overcome this natural, deeply ingrained love of sweet things. And we're succeeding to some extent. At least we understand the problem. So it might be true that our religious sweet tooth was a great idea for a long time. And it might also be true that it isn't a good idea anymore. It might be turning on us now. The fitness of an adaptation, or the fitness enhancing power of an adaptation, is not guaranteed to last forever. And in fact, one of the great sources of evidence about evolution is when we see adaptations which have outlived their usefulness and are now becoming positively harmful. It's simply an open question whether religion, whether the sort of cohesiveness of religion is still good for us. I like the analogy with what my farmer friends in Maine have told me. They call it a nurse crop. When I replanted my hay fields some years ago, one of the local farmers said, well, you want to put down oats as a nurse crop when you plant the timothy, the hay. I said, what do you mean a nurse crop? And he said, well, you plant both seeds at once, and the oats come up first, and they keep out the weeds, and they protect the timothy until it can grow up. And the oats grow up first, and you can harvest the oats if you want, or you can just leave them. They're just sort of a protective shield, a nurse crop for the timothy. And I think that religion may well have been a sort of cultural nurse crop. I don't think we need it anymore, however valuable it may have been in the early days of civilization.
I have a question, you'll be glad to know, about computation, and I suppose that makes it more Dr. Minsky's province, although I'm not fussy. There is no question that access to computation is transforming the sciences. Do you think that scientists are asking different kinds of questions because of that, or are they simply pursuing the questions they would have asked with greater efficiency or in greater depth, or does it depend on what kind of science they practice?
Well, that's a very broad question. There certainly are specific ones that when you see a complicated system, you used to expect to find that there was a complicated source for it. And one of the things that became widely understood since computer science was that simple processes can generate unlimited variety. And so you get these chaos theories, and you no longer need to assume that there's anything random in a system that looks random. There could just be a 30-bit shift register or something like that. So I can't think of more general things to say, but we know about processes that we hadn't imagined before. I'm a little uncomfortable about saying that because in the 1920s there were people like Ackermann and Post in the 1930s who understood chaos, and even Poincaré in the late 19th century knew that there would be someday something like mathematics that would understand these things. But it's since 1950 or 60, the idea that complexity can appear where you wouldn't have expected it before. Incidentally, the public has some idea that quantum mechanics involves uncertainty, and that the quantum world is indeterminate. And the physicists have allowed that to go on for a long time. In the current pictures of quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation is a continuous function and so forth. And for a long time, nobody could think of why packets of light would go this way and that way, apparently at random. And now there are theories about that which don't have any randomness at all. So it's interesting that the public still thinks things are random in modern physics.
Gentlemen, I think we just have time for one more question. Thank you.
On the matter of design and designer, could both of you comment on what perhaps was Einstein's views of that problem or that conundrum, and how come what has happened to bring your ideas of that to bear now?
I have a quick answer to that, which is looking on the past. Einstein is famous for many interesting accomplishments. One is that he was perhaps the most skillful politician of the previous century. He made lots of remarks in public to the press and so forth, and he never made a mistake in his strategy. So he steers the way between the atheists and the religious people so skillfully. Well, I don't want to do it anymore, but I wish I had known how to in the past. So
Einstein, of course, is often quoted as saying that the dear Lord is subtle but not malicious. But he also complained bitterly and often that he didn't himself believe in any personal God of any sort. That was just a metaphor. He was very clear that he did not mean by that or any other reference to God a personal God who could actually be subtle or malicious. And of course, George Williams, the biologist, John mentioned him earlier, is one of our leading Darwinians, and George has famously turned Einstein's famous quote upside down and said that Mother Nature is vicious but stupid.
Thank you all very much. Dan Dennett's latest book is in the store. It's called Freedom Evolves. Marvin Minsky is now 9 years late delivering his book. So if you'd like to encourage him, please do so on the way out. Thank you.
Our thanks to all our guests, John Brockman, Daniel Dennett, Marvin Minsky.
Find out more about these authors' works and other events at Barnes & Noble online at bn.com. Next, New York Times correspondent John Fountain talks about his childhood and the role of faith in his life.